acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to the elders past and present, and extend a very warm welcome to any First Nations people joining us this evening. It's such a thrill to be in conversation with Sarah about this magnificent new book, Slack Tide, which we'll get to in a moment. But I wanted to make a few remarks just to introduce this book to you and Sarah's work to you. For those of you, I imagine there's many readers and lovers of Sarah's work in this room, and hopefully some people who are encountering your work potentially for the first time. I've admired Sarah's work for the better part of 20 years. I remember the first time I read one of her poems in the Best Australian Poetry anthologies a million years ago and being very struck by it. And subsequently, I've really admired Sarah's work. It's very finely honed, very lean, very intelligent, and it plays with temporalities and scale in really surprising ways. It's very alert to ironies and blind spots of human perspective, and shows a really fascinating and enduring interest in the natural world and the relationships between human beings, animals, and the landscape, drawing attention to, as she says in the poem from this new book, Aldinga Cliffs, South Australia, its feral beauty, which I think is a beautiful phrase. The book that we're here to celebrate this evening, Slack Tide, is all about perspectives. These poems view human life and activity from unexpected vantage points, looking in at illuminated apartment windows during the lockdown and seeing in those glowing cubes of activity the landscapes and the rooms of Edward Hopper, looking at human beings on Earth from the Voyager spacecraft hurtling out into deep space, from a swan's upturned head as it sifts through silt. In one really memorable poem, we see the Ukrainian war contemplated from the still landscape of a camping trip in Tasmania. Human beings are seen alternately by sheep who recognise our faces and through the little black headlamps of the eyes of spider crabs. But amid all this seeing, there's an interesting thread, and I want to get to this with Sarah, of the invisible made visible. In one poem, there's a woman making love who is heard but not seen by market goers in Aix-en-Provence. In another poem, the insecticide DDT is invisibly everywhere, permeating a childhood. And there are reasons for despair in these poems, but they're counterbalanced with startling and really rich and vivid imaginings of the world around us, which is revealed to be markedly more mysterious than we might imagine, rife with echoes, correspondences, and connections between things. And these ideas gather together in the book's title, Slack Tide, a phrase we're probably all familiar with, the notion of a tide that is seemingly still, but as the poet notes, may seem to indicate stillness, but can betray strong currents and currents underneath. And I could go on, and I have actually gone on in my notes, as I'm wont to do, but I think we're best to hear from the poet herself. So first of all, can I say, Sarah, congratulations on this magnificent book. Let's start with the title, Slack Tide, which to me seems to tie together the various threads of the section and the correspondences between these poems. Did the title come first? Did it come last? How has the title informed, I suppose, the composition of the poems, if it has? And where did it come from?
The title came from the title of the poem, Slack Tide, which I'll read to you later. And once I'd collected the manuscript together, it seemed very relevant to the currents running through the book of because this collection, probably more than any of my other books, looks out to the public world, particularly in the first section, and the currents that we all live with, the invisible currents of neoliberalism, and more recently, when I was well into the book, then there was the epidemic, the pandemic, climate change, and when I was immersed in a slack tide in the dark of a Hobart winter, one evening helping my daughter with her field work in a marsh, salt marsh, feeling the tug of that uncertain tide, not knowing whether it was coming in or going out, and that can last quite a long time. It can last up to half an hour or more. It just seemed to describe what a lot of these poems are about, that we live with a sense of, water can seem quite calm on the surface during slack tide, but these huge gravitational competitions are going on under the surface, and it seemed to describe what I was doing in a number of the poems in the book.
And I'm fascinated to hear you say that for you this is sort of the boldest foray you've made into what we might call the public poem, or the poem that engages with those questions of geopolitics, of these kind of currents that we swim in. And I'm interested because I would think of your poetry broadly as lyric poems, and for those in the room who are familiar with this, the lyric is generally a single speaker, an I, often dramatising a kind of moment. And to me there's an interesting kind of tension, I think, in using the lyric mode to address these public ideas. And I wonder, has it taken time to come round to work out how to affect that in the poem? How have you found those tensions, I suppose, between the lyric mode and public engagement in that way? I
think the notion that the lyric mode is a very private, personal, interior mode has come about over the last 150 years. It's a fairly recent concept. I think back in time, 1,000 and maybe 2,000 years ago, it was the political and the lyric, the social and the lyric weren't necessarily at odds. But I guess where all this started was my thinking about particularly W.H. Auden and other poets who address the topical very explicitly, and yet write poems which endure. And the obvious example is W.H. Auden's September the 1st, 1939, which was responding so precisely to what was going on in Europe, the invasion of Warsaw. And he begins, I sit in one of the dives in 52nd Street, uncertain and afraid, as the clever hopes expire of a low, dishonest decade. And what he does in that poem, which is a lyric poem, is take us into the mood of the time. He's produced a poem which surfaces. People were sending this poem around after 9/11. After political and human crises, people are reminded of this poem, and I was compelled and fascinated by the way the lyric poem can lend itself so powerfully to what's going on in the public domain. And I guess I had a sense, I hadn't quite verbalised that to myself, but I had a sense that that was what I was wanting to do in the first section of this book.
And I think these poems do that to me through a very interesting movement, in that the poems are politically engaged but in a complex kind of way, in which these are not didactic poems, and they're not poems that tell you what to think or tell you how to think. To me, there's an interesting kind of tonal, almost ambivalence, in which these seismic kind of human events are sometimes viewed through the human lens. We have poems of the pandemic and that sense of sort of isolation and capsule kind of life that human beings are undergoing, but seen at times from the animal world that is operating on an entirely different sort of time frame, an entirely different set of concerns, and totally absent, of any knowledge particularly of the human realm. And I'm interested if you could speak a little bit. I mean, I feel that these poems have that dual perspective running through them in a really interesting tension. And is that sort of a deliberate thing? Is that something that you think about, the ways in which the human lens, shapes perception? It seems to me to be the subject of these poems in so many ways.
When I was thinking about public issues and putting them into poetic form. What I didn't want to do was to be providing people with what they might read in the news. I didn't want to... The poems weren't a record of what, particularly with the pandemic, what we were being inundated with through the media. I was more interested, and a phrase of Michael Lunig's, who I heard at a festival some years ago, who said that in his work he listens to the whisperings of society. I was more interested in the impact of these under the submerged forces going on in our lives and how we experience them under our skin, the impact that they have on us individually and collectively. And I guess that's what I was hoping to achieve in
I think
a number of the poems.
I think they really do, and I think they hold the individual and the collective in interesting tension as well. And alongside these sort of beautiful public poems, there are some really astonishing and, I think probably one of the standout poems for me that I found myself returning to again are family poems, and particularly a poem about a grandmother who spent 2/3 of her life institutionalised in an asylum. And there's a beautiful kind of tension, but also echoes, I suppose, of the kind of sense of isolation, the sense of sort of contraction of a life that we have in the pandemic, publicly, that then enters into these private, more personal poems. I was curious to hear a little more of the genesis of that poem. It's a magnificent poem, but also to hear how you find writing about family. I mean, I've admired your poems about, we share, I think, an interest in representations of ageing and questions of, parents, in decline in various ways. And now there are these beautiful poems about your grandmother. Could you talk a little bit about, I suppose, how you approach the writing of those family stories and how they work, in that context of the more public poems?
All right, perhaps I just better tell some backstory first.
Please.
So at the age of 9, I asked my mother why we called our grandmother by her first name and not grandma. And the impact of that on my mother was, on my otherwise calm, composed mother, was so shocking. I wasn't sure whether she was raging with anger or about to cry, but I disappeared into the garden because I couldn't bear to see what I'd done to her. It was as if she was being strangled before my eyes. And over the years, with childish persistence, I thought she must have died, and I discovered that she had been committed, and when my mother was 10 years old. And I guess really from that age, early age, I wanted to know more. I wanted to know who my grandmother was and why she had been locked away from society. And as a young teenager, I started saving up. I was the youngest in my family I was the youngest in my family. We emigrated in the 60s, and I was the first one to go back. I was driven by the desire to know who my grandmother was. And the taboo, which had choked my mother and made her unable to speak, held fast in England. The only people who would speak to me about her were her sisters, and they were forthcoming, but they weren't able to take me to see her, to meet her. And sadly, the opportunity was lost because by the time I arrived back, a couple of years later, she had died. Nevertheless, my desire to know about her continued, and it has been much of my life. I've gone back to England on a sort of pilgrimage, trying to find out what I can about her, and it has been very, very difficult and a slow process. So the poem about my grandmother is about that journey, those geographic, psychological and emotional journeys I've taken to find out about her. And what I've found out about all the many, tens, hundreds of thousands of women who were taken away from their families and incarcerated, not just in England, in all around the world. So it's a poem, it's a personal poem, and it's a poem about the suppression of private and public memory.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about, I suppose, the presence of England in these poems and your relationship, to England, and I think you've probably answered that very beautifully. And it's a magnificent poem, a complex poem. I wanted to take us maybe to another poem, this great poem, "The Long Clock," which takes as its subject the clock of the long now. And if you don't know what the clock of the long now is, you are not alone. I did not know what the clock of the long now was either. It's a concept, as I understand it, of an American inventor, Danny Hills, an object which plays with timescales. And this poem that Sarah's written about the clock of the long now, which I'm hoping she'll tell us about in a moment, concludes with the idea of unerring faith in the long vision. And I wanted to ask you, I'm tempted to read that as an analogy for the work of poetry, that poetry requires unerring faith in the long vision in a range of ways, including just the faith in continuing to write poetry in a time and place as we are now. But I wondered if you'd tell us a little bit about that clock and its relationship to poetry.
All right. So first of all, I think there's great solace, comfort to be found in, firstly in nature. That's where I go when I need to get my bearings, and that's where probably most people go. I also think that it's grounding and comforting to consider everything through the lens of long time, geological time, mountain time. And so I was very excited to find out that Danny Hills, who's a computer technologist and philosopher, was making a human-made object, a mechanical clock, in the heart of a mountain in Texas, which was a tribute to our relationship to the future. So he's boring down through, a very long distance underground through a Texan mountain. The clock is well on the way to being built if it isn't finished. It ticks once a year. The century hand moves once every 100 years, and its cuckoo comes out every 1,000 years. And it has been designed to last 10,000 years. And I really love that concept that there are people out there. He's also part of his collaborative team. He works with Brian Eno as well, who's an interesting character and does incredible work. So I loved reading about the long clock. I've forgotten the other part of your question.
Oh, and just, I was tempted to read it in a way as an analogy for poetry.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, and yeah. I'm curious, I think to write poetry in Australia requires significant faith in a range of things that may or may not eventuate. And I just wondered, is there some analogy there for the work of the poet?
Well, yes, and one of the poems very close to it, called River Pans, actually draws that connection between geological time and poetry. And it's one of the things that drew me to, one of the many, many things that drew me to poetry from the start, is the way it time travels. You read poems written by those beautiful Sumerian, 4,000-year-old Sumerian love poems, to the bride to her groom and a mother to her baby. And suddenly 4,000 years of human consciousness just turns into a blink. Poetry is another example of long time, and it's so helpful, I think, in troubled times, and we do live in troubled times, to change our lens, to change our perspective and see that humans are not at the centre of everything. We are part of a whole, which is why it's always so good to get out in the natural world. And poetry contributes to that long sense of everything.
I love that. And there's another poem that I'm thinking of, Falling, which has the great phrase, the tedium of fear. And I was thinking of the pandemic in relation to that, but so much else too. You know, these poems address climate change, they address, in some instances, the experiences of migrants and asylum seekers coming to another country, and yet there is a defiant tone to the poems in that they will not concede to the tedium of fear. And I will read a few lines here. There's a scene in which I believe there's people calling in on the radio, and the lines are, as if the testimony of hardship is going somewhere that might help. Instead, hardship just seems to grow itself and grow the hunger for such stories. And I was fascinated to read this. I think it, in interesting ways, runs counter to the current, to some contemporary currents that indulge narratives of hardship and seem to seek them out. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit, I suppose, about the stance of the poems in relation to that fear.
Well, I think if we're troubled by things, I'll speak personally, to step back, to gain some distance is a way out of anxiety or despair. It's empowering to step back. It's not so that we're not, whether we're talking about personal trouble or public problems, gaining a little distance is always helpful. And I mean, you would know this from all the incredible poems you've written about your father and his illness. The striking things about those poems is that you allow the poem and the reader the space in which to feel what's going on. We're not, you know, if you cry onto the page, the reader can only can only see your tears. They can't see what's making you feel the tears. And your poems to your father allow us that space to examine their universality. So they become something much greater than one individual's experience.
And I felt that very much in this book, that there was so much space, I think, to draw connections. There's a lot of trust in the reader. There's a lot of juxtaposition. There's many forces, that kind of, that I suppose join together in each poem. And I really loved and admired the sense of space between those things for the reader to kind of gather them together. And that kind of brings me to the process of composing the poems and composing the book. And it's a question that poets are always asked, how do you write a poem? And, I say that with a sort of tone of slight despair because, the answer is often not very interesting. And yet, in this case, I'm very interested in how these poems come about because they're very unusual poems. They really make fascinating leaps as they step through their ideas. And I'm genuinely curious about how a poem comes about for you. Do you have a shape of the poem in mind? Do you have an intellectual territory that you then gather these things together? Are there fragments that somehow merge? I mean, it's genuinely interesting to me how you kind of work this material together.
All of those things, but primarily I listen for them. A lyric poem is nothing if it's not an audible, oral acoustic sensation. And so I might have an idea, for example, the poem about the woman in Aix-en-Provence. That memory was with me for 30 years, and I knew what I wanted to say, but I couldn't hear it. So some poems, the experience comes with the sound of the poem, and an idea is nothing without its kind of musical carriage. So I listen, and part of the focus of preparing myself to begin a poem is listening for it.
That's a beautiful way to think of it, and the music of the poem, you know, is present in all your work, in your entire body of work. And I know you've done some collaboration with composers, that music is a realm that bridges, in a sense, with poetry. And another kind of feature of this book is, I suppose, it's incredibly sort of diverse in the intellectual territory and interdisciplinary territory that it kind of draws on. And there's music, but there's also science, there's philosophy. And I mean, I think poetry often can wrongly be maligned as a sort of insular form, but these poems are open, you know, in really productive ways with other disciplines. And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about I suppose, your interdisciplinary interests and how they inform the way the poems come together.
It's more that the poem leads me to those things, you know, art has always been a part of my adult life, and sometimes art comes into the poetry because it's a part of my life, just as the experience of seeing log trucks driving our forests down the main road of Hobart is part of life, or overhearing a conversation on a bus. And music has always been part of my life, so poems lead me to music, and little quotes I might write down about philosophy or history, the poem takes me to them. Does that make sense?
It does, and with all this talk of listening to the music of the poem, I think it might be time to hear the music of the poem. So Sarah's now going to read some poems from Slack Tide to us. As she does, if you think of any questions at the end of this session, there'll be the opportunity to ask them, so please don't be shy when we get to that time. And over to you, Sarah.
Okay, thank you. So I'll start with Slack Tide. This is the poem I told you about that I was fortunate enough to be invited by my daughter to be one of her field assistants in the middle of a Tasmanian winter, in the middle of a salt marsh, up to my waist in freezing water in waders. But what an experience it turned out to be. Slack Tide. In the middle of COVID. As if existing uncertainty did not suffice, now in the depth of night, this stepping from firm ground into mud, from the blackness of air into blackness of water. Already level with the road behind us, water quietly steals to meet itself across the gravel causeway. Barometers will not be disappointed tonight. The familiar is strange as an underwater garden in lamplight, an arrangement of star-struck shrubs and tiny trees, idealized metropolis for a myriad fish for whom the enchanting is quite normal. Neither are they troubled by our turbid wake. This was a world we thought we knew by daylight, but it resembles nothing that we know, insists we think like water at slack tide, ambivalent, sensing whether to come or go. The smell of saltbush, mud with its life and decay, as oyster catchers fill the moonless night with urgency. The city's glow, a dim unease. Water's insistence grips the thighs, disturbs and pacifies. Deep mud reminds us we were never invulnerable. Silver eels with intelligent faces examine ours, assess our aptitude. The swoosh of waders draws us into a primordial past, and, in the watery iridescence through a vision of sorts, precarious, illustrious as the ontology of glasswort. Let the sea roar beyond the dunes. In the stillness of the tide's departure, the salt marsh breathes. That this new world is lit up by the light of our lamps does not mean it was not here before. This one's called Nomic. The crescent honey-eater on the other side of the glass, caller of the highest chime, is too busy for song, intent as he is just now on the nectar of red fuchsia flowers and on the act of balancing upside down, sideways, right way, to reach into each slim recess with that improbably long, quick tongue. For a moment, a second really, the relentless statistics on today's news blur behind the intimacy of the beating wings, the tiny flower relinquishing its sweetness to the busy tongue. Thank you. To Hassan. To Hassan and to the other men from Afghanistan and Iran and Iraq who prepared a feast for me one midday years ago on my way to work, laid the clean sheets smooth on the worn carpet of the furnitureless house, placed dishes of spiced rice and chickpeas and slid a plate towards me. There were not enough plates to go round, and with upturned palms urged me to eat first. I want to say thank you. I'll always remember that meal, your hospitality and kindness, the cool of the empty room as I stepped off the busy street and out of the sun to join you for what I thought would be a glass of black tea. I want to say sorry, though, that I left too soon, that I let my job call me away. I'm sorry, Hassan, that by the time I returned with the paper and pencils and tubes of paint you needed, the house was boarded up. You'd been moved on. I'm sorry to say that I've forgotten your friends' names. I'm sorry that my imagination could barely grasp that deep water and fearless waves could look like hope. Most of all, I'm sorry for my ignorance that statelessness in this country might also look like the view from a small boat on a hostile ocean, except with no coast to train the eye. Prince of Wales Bay. Ali and his bride, who prefers not to be named, are out walking in the early winter evening. Sleeping ducks murmur as they pass. The old dockyard ripples upside down in the light from a few street lamps. A drunk appears out of the night and scruffs his shirt, tearing it. You think you're tougher than me? No, says Ali. I think you are tougher than me. He is serious, but maybe the drunk thinks he's being smart and bites him hard on the arm. The ducks have fallen silent. The awkward ring of tooth marks slowly fills with blood. The drunken man wanders away somewhere in the dark, out of sight. So, thinks Ali, a man in his new country has tried to take a piece of him. It hurts, but he can live with the red and purple bruises made by one man's teeth. He has lost a father to gunfire, a young brother and sister, The pain that is imprinted on his biceps is only the size of a man's mouth. That poem was written with permission from Ali to tell that story. In Tasmania we have a river ooze. In the UK there are river oozes all over the place because ooze is the Celtic word for water. And in Norfolk there's a particularly impressive ooze river which has a 6-metre tidal rise and fall. So it's an incredibly dramatic event when the tide comes in and goes out. Ooze. In the glistening flats when the emptied river has poured into the wash and the broad-bottomed fishing smack rests its matter-of-factness on mud. In the silence of the incoming tide, its meniscus stealing up the mud, rising before your eyes, and the muscular eel of the river's energy driving inland. In the king tide under a full moon, waters spreading wide from bank to bank, then climbing the quay wall, its silent mass lifting both jetty and fishing smack with its slung necks flush with the dock, tensing the town to within inches of the warning bell and the floodgates closing, lies the weighty drama with its huge rise and fall, its quiet heft and shove, day and night, year after year, the bass salt pulse like the tempo of slow breath bringing oxygen to the blood, the rhythm holding sway, never letting up, rising, falling, finding its way. Are we going to time?
About sort of 9 minutes.
9 more minutes, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe, yeah.
I'll read Aix-en-Provence. Her climax, when it came, was operatic. The whole marketplace hanging on rising notes that flew through shutters to join the blue, blue sky. Saturday morning shoppers, begonias, sunflowers blazing in tall buckets, brazen watermelons, the patient hands of the town hall clock, all arrested as one. Scarlet chrysanthemums opened themselves like sea anemones in a warm current. Women touched the blooms, handled ripe tomatoes, smiled at one another. Tourists and old women in aprons alike. I don't know what others felt, but perhaps women felt opened, released. Perhaps we were exposed. The bananas looked yellower, the grapes more purple, the marigolds bolder. People glanced shyly to the open window on the first floor of the cobbled square. Did they expect her to appear? Then a large man in a tiny three-wheeled truck entered the scene, revving hard in low gear, as if everything depended on his heavy load of something green. Above the crowd, a strand of cloud tidied the sky back together, and the minute hand of the inscrutable clock moved on as custom required. What else shall I read, Sarah?
I'd love you to read Aldinga Cliffs, South Australia. Would you read that one?
Sure.
That one's so beautiful.
2 more. Aldinga Cliffs, South Australia. There's no getting away from things. There is driving, then walking miles along a quiet coast on a rising tide, with the back of the mind consciousness that in an hour or so the sea will have reached the cliffs of shale with their pebble threads to denote other epochs of earth events, and that you will be wading in water on return. There is walking the distance to see the monarch butterflies mating, their wings like stained glass window panes. And you wonder who is upside down, the male or the female, and do they notice? And you think of the fine detail of pleasure that such creatures achieve in coitus, assuming there is allure and pleasure for them to come together at all. The western light of the sun going down over the ocean, lighting up the orange mosaic inside the black crays, and you have to draw attention into that feral beauty and not notice it is sea spurge and invasive weeds that are their lovers' beds in the cove in the cliff, and that the cliffs themselves are being eaten away by the ocean and wind and rain, by runnels and rivers that have not soaked into earth because the land for miles has been raised of its trees and scrub and native grasses, and overgrazed so that topsoil has followed rainwater down to the sea. Again, you give your attention to the mating monarchs, and when the light evaporates them, you look instead at the shingle beneath your feet, a sacred ground it might be with its volcanic stones suffused with coloured hieroglyphs, the embossed, the smooth, the Japanese, the expressionists, the Fred Williamses and Clarice Beckett's, meanwhile the sun sliding close to the horizon like a Beckett sky itself. And you try to appreciate the way it lights up plastics, drinking straws and bottle tops, nylon string, frayed ropes, bits of bags. At all times, there is this living with what some of us have done. There is this under the skin knowing and a constant trying to say it will all work out, trying not to let hope crack like ancient stones, like the lead lines in the stained glass pattern of the monarch wings. Thank you. And I'll finish with a little poem called Solace. Can find it. Solace. To steady the mind, there is, as always, the moon, whole, quartered, halved, and the many stars, space, deep blue by night, paler in daylight comforts. We might almost think our great mistakes, inscribed onto land, atmosphere, ocean, were minor, trifling. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. What a beautiful reading. We now have about 10, 12 minutes or so for questions. Please don't be shy. Sarah lives in Tasmania usually, so that rare are the opportunities to ask in-person questions of her in Sydney. Does anyone have a burning question that they'd like to ask? I have another 3 pages, but you've probably heard enough of mine.
Sarah, I think I have one. Thank you. It's lovely to hear your work.
Thank
Sarah,
you.
And to listen to you, Sarah, too. James Longenbach, the American poet and critic, says, I think that poetry is the sound of language organised into lines, which is quite lovely, but poems write sentences too. And I just want to applaud the beauty of your sentences, as well as the lines.
Thank you.
So that's a comment, and thank you. But I have a question about the listening thing. What is it you think, is there anything in particular that triggers the listening, do you think? Is it perhaps reading a poem? Just going back to Sarah's question and your answer to it, which was lovely, but can you put your finger on what might induce the listening, or the words that are apt for the thing?
And I've got to repeat this for those listening online. There was a lovely compliment initially about Sarah's beautiful sentences as well as her lines, and then the question was, as you attempt to listen for the poem, are there any practices, are there any things that you can do to induce what prompts that listening? I hope I've accurately summarised the question.
I need time and space. You have to be able to focus so hard to begin writing poetry. I think I was going to say my whole body's involved in listening for a poem, and I think probably many readers would feel when they're reading a lyric poem that there's more than the brain, there's more than the mind involved when we respond to a poem. And there are particular poems that we come across from time to time during our lives that we almost want to, or do absorb, we almost want to know them by heart because they're affecting us somatically. We kind of receive them through our body. And there's something of that process. I really can't say a lot more than that it's not just a cerebral process, it's not just something of the mind. The rhythms, the textures, the patterning, word patternings, they are what help the poem come into being, I think.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow up on that previous question. It's lovely to hear you reading.
Thank you.
And of course you live in Tasmania, where it's a wonderful place to walk. And I've found that one of the ways that a rhythm of a poem comes, or one of the times I should say, is walking. Do you do much walking?
I do a lot of walking, and I walk around the room when I'm writing, and I speak out loud. It's I remember our children coming home and thinking there was somebody in the room with me. I make sounds when I'm composing a poem. It is a composition. It's a bit like a musical. Yeah.
And it's a rhythmic activity too, of course.
And it releases the mind, walking, not just for writing poetry, of course.
Wonderful. Other questions? Yes.
Martin.
I was just going to start like Martin with a compliment. I really, really admired with the political poems that you read how incredibly tight they were. There was no, they went right to the heart of things. Did you achieve that through a lot of elimination of lines and things that you felt were unnecessary, or did they sort of come ready-made with that tightness?
And just repeating for the podcast, that the question was around the tightness of your political poems and how you achieve that, whether there's a lot of editing and deleting involved to get to that kernel of the poem.
Probably both. There are some, some poems arrive as a gift and almost write themselves, but I think I spend a lot more time paring back than I do the first writing. So yes, just that.
Because I thought they were extraordinary.
I thank you, Peter. I take that as a great compliment from you.
Thank you.
Sarah, the reading thing, does your need for rhythm clash sometimes with the text you're reading?
Can you say a bit more?
So you've got your own bodily sense of rhythm in language. Does that clash sometimes if the text you're reading, not your own, but someone else's, has other rhythms or doesn't have sufficient rhythm?
When I'm reading other people's work? Sometimes, and sometimes in interesting and productive ways, yeah. And sometimes there can be clashes between rhythm and subject matter. I mean, Auden is an expert at creating tension. Like sometimes he can almost use nursery rhyme rhythms to convey pretty weighty, serious content, and the poem comes into being because of the clash between that jauntiness and the gravity of what the poem's actually saying. So it doesn't always have to work in a sort of harmonic way with the content.
If you'll forgive me for sneaking in a question when I'm not supposed to, off the back of that, I'm curious about the role that form plays in your poems, and there are a number of villanelles in here, sonnet, and that can be a space in which there is a sort of set rhythm, or a set structure that then the poem has to kind of work its way into. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the appeal of form in your writing and how you go about approaching that. Do you know that you're writing a poem in a form from the beginning, or does sometimes the poem kind of find itself into that shape?
Usually, but now and then I have a go at formal and free verse to address the same subject and see which one suits the subject best. Writing a formal poem, I think, uses a very different part of the brain from writing free verse. There's almost an element of problem solving in it, which is challenging and enjoyable. I love the song-like form of the villanelle, and I love the way it lends itself. A villanelle is actually originated in early Italy, 14th century Italy, I think, and I think it began as a rural song. So you're recycling lines like a chorus, and that lends itself to levity. I sometimes write poems with more levity than my free verse poems. Somehow their formality is freeing in interesting ways. I love the sonnet form. I love the way it's like a little piece of dark matter, that it enfolds so much into its tight little form. Carol Ann Duffy's an expert at the modern sonnet form.
Beautiful, thank you. Other questions from the audience? Anyone, please?
I don't know if this is a question, Sarah. Thank you, and it was really beautiful to hear you read it.
Thanks.
To return to the first poem that you read, the Slack Tide, I am entirely repulsed by the idea of going into the water at night in that murky horror. And I'm really grateful that I don't know. So I was really...
It's smelly too.
And of course it would be. And everything else that, and you talk about the really lovely faces of, and I'm pleased that happened, but I'm not entirely accepting. So I love that kind of murkiness, and I love that as being a contract with your daughter as well, that entering into that journey. And also, if I'm remembering correctly, please, that you are not outside the city in a way, because you talk about the city itself in that poem as well. So it seems to me there's a lot going on in terms of the levels and the murkiness and the immediacy and the family. So if I make a question out of that, can you speak to the interactions between those dimensions of that, well, physical and psychic horror, the familial and the city? Yeah.
Yep. And in a number of those poems in the first part of the book, I'm looking at the way in which, no matter how far away we go, whether it's waist deep in mud and cold ocean, salt marsh, or up on the mountains of the Central Plateau of Tasmania, miles from one of the remotest parts of the island, how difficult it is to separate ourselves from our knowledge of what's going on in the rest of the world. So, as far as the notion of escaping to an island or escaping to the wilderness, we don't say wilderness anymore, escaping to remote places, we're part of the main, we're part of the global human society, and this comes up in a number of the poems. It's not possible to get away from that. We take our knowledge of what's going on to other people in the world with us. And so the poems are thinking hard about just that.
I think that is a really beautiful note on which to end this marvel of a conversation. So I would like to, first of all, congratulate Sarah, and I hope you'll join me on her magnificent book, Slack Tide.
Thank you, thank you.
It's such an amazing achievement. There are many copies outside. I encourage you to buy one and have her sign them. It's an incredibly handsome edition by Pitt St Press. And, you know, congratulations to John and Lindsay on their incredible work in producing an amazing series of poetry.
And I would like to warmly thank John and Lindsay for their encouragement and support, the tremendous input they've had in assisting me to bring this book into being. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
And that concludes the event. So please